In 1920, something historic happened. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed, giving women the right to vote. For a nation that once tried to outlaw alcohol and has a pretty bad history of treating women as property, this was a big deal. It's even more unbelievable when you consider this. The constitutional amendment passed by exactly one vote. And, in the end, it was likely a well-timed letter to a new state representative from his mother that put this amendment over the top. If you know anything about the founding and original history of the United States, you know that women weren't, shall we say, treated well or equally. The original United States Constitution only allowed for white male property owners to vote. That would change slowly during the 18th and 19th centuries, but the right to vote was typically only expanded to men. Of course, this was one of a series of rights not granted to women. In many cases, women didn't have the ability to own property, open their own bank accounts, or even get a divorce. The women's suffrage movement began to take hold in the 1840s, when the Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights passed a resolution demanding the right to vote. As time went on, more groups were formed, including the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association. The strength of the suffrage movement would be aided by many legends in this political era, including Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Carrie Chapman Catt. Now, let's be clear. Women weren't treated as second-class citizens when it came to their voting rights everywhere in the United States. Typically, states have wide discretion over their voting rights, and in the 19th century they began to deploy that discretion when it came to giving women the right to vote. In 1869, Wyoming became the first state that gave women the right to vote. That was followed by Utah, Colorado, Idaho, and Washington State. By the time women gained the right to vote across the country, 15 states had given women full suffrage, and most states in the Union, though not all, had given women some sort of right to vote. However, the state-by-state approach wasn't nearly enough, and suffrage supporters moved towards a constitutional amendment. The text of the amendment itself was simple. The right of citizens in the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex, with an added line about Congress being able to enforce the amendment. For those of you who are unaware, the Constitution is the founding guiding legal document of the United States. All laws are based on it, and it reigns supreme, subject to interpretation, over the United States legal system. That is why amending the Constitution is so tough. It's only happened 27 times in United States history. As such, women's suffrage supporters had a long, long way to go to achieve passage. The process to amend the U.S. Constitution is an arduous one. First, legislation must pass by a 2/3 margin in both the United States House of Representatives and the Senate. Next, 3/4 of all states, through their state legislatures, must pass the resolution. Once that happens, the amendment is law of the land. And that's where it gets tricky. But after decades of concentrated efforts, women's suffrage activists finally had momentum. After multiple failed efforts, the 19th Amendment finally made it through Congress in 1919. With the support of Democratic President Woodrow Wilson, and over the objection of many other Democrats, including particularly Southern Democrats, Congress passed the 19th Amendment by the necessary 2/3 margin. On to the states. States large and small quickly ratified the amendment, and by the conclusion of 1919, 22 states had actually passed it. Things got tricky from there. While western, northern, and mid-Atlantic states tended to favor ratification, southern states did not. The reasons are multifaceted, but they include good old-fashioned racism, a general sense of cultural conservatism, a fear that women would become too involved in politics to manage their homes, whatever, and a fear that women would push for prohibition. By the way, that last one actually came true, but that's a story for another video. That being said, momentum still grew. On March 22, 1920, Washington State ratified the amendment, becoming the 35th state to do so. This meant that the ratification in just one more state would turn the amendment into law. Tennessee appeared the likeliest state, and so the entire suffrage fight, pro and against, turned to the state, delivering speeches, conducting campaigns, and trying to convince state legislators to vote for or against the measure. The movement did gain many prominent supporters, including Democratic Governor Albert Roberts. The Tennessee legislative session began on August 9th, and legislators arrived in Nashville from across the state. Those in favor of universal suffrage wore yellow roses. Those opposed wore red. And that is where the name of a man who would have otherwise faded into history, Harry Byrne, enters the story. Byrne, just 24 years old, was a brand new Tennessee state representative. He was a Republican and expected to vote against the measure. He even arrived in Nashville with a red rose. Lobbying and speeches was intense, with advocates for both sides greeting legislators on the trains as they arrived. There was no real question about the measure in the Tennessee State Senate. It passed by a vote of 24-5. On to the House, where it was opposed by many, including House Speaker Seth Walker. On August 18, 1920, Speaker Walker attempted to table the bill, meaning stop all debate and not vote on it. That vote tied 48-48, meaning that the motion failed. Representative Byrne voted with the Speaker, a Republican like him, to table the bill. Now, procedural votes are usually a precursor to the final vote on a bill, so the 48-48 tie was actually bad news for supporters of the suffrage movement. If the final vote tied at 48, it would fail. It needed a majority, 50% plus 1, to pass. There was debate, and then there was the vote, and there was a stunner. In a quiet voice, Representative Byrne voted yes on the legislation. It passed 49-47, the bare minimum necessary for the amendment to be ratified in Tennessee. What had happened? Why had Byrne voted to table the bill, only to vote in favor of the legislation when it came to a final question? Well, Harry Byrne got a 7-page letter from his mother. Shortly before the vote, Byrne received a letter from Phoebe Ensminger Byrne, his mom, urging him to vote for ratification. The 7-page note read, in part, "Hurrah, and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were bitter. I have been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything yet." Then, referring to Carrie Chapman Catt, one of the leaders of the suffrage movement, Miss Byrne told her son to, quote, "be a good boy and help Miss Catt put the rat in ratification." After the vote, and fearing for his safety, Byrne ran to the attic of the Tennessee State Capitol, where he hid until the clamor died down. Speaker Walker attempted to file a motion to reconsider, meaning to vote on the bill again and hope that he could convince someone to change their mind. When that failed, 37 members actually fled the state capitol in an attempt to take enough members away from session so that the process would be stopped. Yet that didn't work. The amendment had passed. It was over. Women could vote in the United States effective 1920. In a speech the next day, Byrne explained his reversal, saying, quote, "I believe we had a moral and legal right to ratify." Byrne said that he personally favored giving women the right to vote, although he thought his constituents opposed it, hence his previous opposition. But he was also honest in his speech, adding, quote, "I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification." In 1920, for the first time, women could vote in a presidential election across the United States. And at least 9 million women did so, with an overwhelming majority of women's votes likely going to Republican Warren G. Harding. Given the broad-based Republican support of women's suffrage and broad-based Democratic opposition, this isn't surprising, but it was also a sign of the times. Republicans beat the Democrats by a 26% margin in the popular vote. By raw numbers, that meant nearly 7 million votes out of over 25 million cast. It was a landslide. So, did women getting the right to vote change the outcome of that presidential election? Probably not. Despite the massive turnout increase, it was one of the highest ever recorded between presidential elections, the Republican ticket of Harding Coolidge crushed the Democratic ticket of Cox Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt. Yeah, that one. That may be the subject of another video too, but we'll get there later. Now, let's address one more issue. Did Phoebe Ensminger Byrne's letter save the women's suffrage movement in the United States? Probably not. But there's some caveats. There is no doubt that women would have gotten the right to vote at some point in the very near future, even if Byrne had cold-heartedly rejected his mother. In fact, Connecticut would vote to approve the 19th Amendment barely a month after Tennessee did, and Vermont a few months after that. However, and I say this as a politician, the easiest thing an elected official can politically do is vote yes when it doesn't matter. Had the vote in Tennessee failed, it is very possible that the vote in Connecticut and Vermont would never have happened, or would have failed itself. That could have kept women out of the 1920 election. Again, we're talking about delaying the inevitable. Women were going to get the right to vote, it was just a question of when, but Miss Burns' note may have created a crucial timing question. Her letter may have impacted other races in 1920, including House, Senate, and governor's races, where women's votes may have proven decisive. So no, Miss Burns' letter and her son's vote didn't save women's suffrage in the United States, but it very likely impacted the timing, and that alone clearly impacted history. And one more thing, a happy epilogue to this story: don't feel too bad for Harry Byrne. Despite having every name in the world hurled at him, including completely meritless accusations of bribery, Byrne would win re-election in 1920. He would later serve in the state Senate, on the State Planning Commission, and as a delegate to multiple state constitutional conventions. He would actually run for governor in 1930, but didn't win the Republican Party's nomination. Byrne would later reflect proudly on his vote, often citing his mother's role, saying, quote, "My mother was a college woman, a student of national and international affairs who took interest in all public issues. She could not vote. Yet, the tenant farmers on our farm, some of whom were illiterate, could vote. On that roll call, confronted with the fact that I was going to go on record for time and eternity on the merits of the question, I had to vote for ratification. May all elected officials always show such an eye for history." That is a perfect place to end this video. As always, my friends, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you did. Emphasis on that last one. There's nothing more important to a YouTuber than subscriptions. So if you like what I had to say, please click on that subscribe button below. As always, have a wonderful day out there, and don't let there be any almost in your life. Take care, everybody.